think everyone knows our speaker this evening, Pat Dorsey, old friend of the Dallas Fly Fishers. Pat's in from Evergreen, Colorado. And Pat, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me out. I'll try a bunch of little stuff, if that's okay with you guys.
Great.
Kind of my forte.
What are we looking at there?
That's a Griffith gnat right there. I think we'll tie that one and just here in just a little bit.
16 or 18?
That was an 18 there. I'm gonna just briefly go through the life cycle of a midge. And we're gonna do a larva, a couple pupas, and an adult. And then we can go into a couple mayflies as well. So midge larvae are very, very important in our trout streams. You know, it's amazing how many larvae are per square meter. You know, they can be anywhere from 800 to 2,000 larvae per square meter in our trout streams. And predominantly two different colors. We have a pale olive larva and red larva. Those are the two that we most frequently will see if we were to seine or do a throat pump of something like that. The olive ones are a little more common than the red ones. The red ones contain hemoglobin, and those are the ones that live in the low oxygenated parts of our stream because they've got an oxygen carrying pigment. So that's probably a little bit more than you want to know about that. But so this is a Chimco.
Cooler in here.
Did I bump something?
You're good.
Oh, okay. I was like, oh my gosh. This is a Timco 2487, a little scud hook. I typically tie my larvas in a 18 or a 20. We'll begin here with a jam knot. And this is an 8/0 light Cahill thread. We'll take some micro tubing and we will attach that tubing right there, and then we're going to pull that tubing and stretch it just a little bit and advance that tubing right along the top of the shank. We're going to work back forward here with symmetrical touching wraps. And when you look at a larva, they look like little segmented tubes. They're uniform throughout their body, and they do have very noticeable segmentation. So now we're going to take this micro tubing now, and we're going to put a medium tension on it, and we're just going to advance this forward, just like that, to create the little worm appearance here. And then another distinguishing feature of a midge larva is their head. It's very pronounced, and if you look at them, you'll see it. It's very clear. The thing is, we can imitate that very easily with just a few wraps of tying thread, just like that. And you can see now we have a nice little head. That's a great monitor. And then we'll do a whip finish. Typically, with my larva patterns, I'm fishing them closer to the substrate, quite a bit more lead than I would if I was fishing with pupa. So pretty much dredging these down. This would be a lead fly in a tandem nymphing rig, possibly trail a pupa behind it. That would be a pretty good call. I always like to run my pupas in the trailing position and my larvas a little bit closer to the lead. So that's a pattern right there that less is more. Very simple but very effective. Anytime there's a small increase in flow on the tailwater, it'd be a good time to fish that. If there's opportunistic fish, they're always looking for larvae too, because they get knocked loose from the substrate. Anybody have any questions with that?
And you're just going to vary the colors depending upon what you're in the water? Or?
I tie them. I tie a red larva. Now you could do the exact same thing here with this clear tubing and just use red thread. I tie some with little red beads, and I brought some of my tailwater boxes here, and you guys or gals are welcome to come up and look at these. So I brought a bunch of this little stuff that we fish back in Colorado. But you'll see in here I have a couple different variations of the red larva as well. Sometimes with beads, sometimes with glass beads, and you can really just let your imagination wander all over the place.
That work as a still water pattern as well.
It will, it will. I mean, I'd be happy to, we can tie up a red larva real quick if you'd like. Let's just tie one up real quick. You guys fish a lot of still waters?
I do.
You know, a blood midge is a really important on a still water. For this pattern, I call it a mercury blood midge. And a lot of my flies have little glass beads on them, and it's a little silver lined glass bead. And the reason that I put those on a lot of my flies is that when midges emerge, they get trapped gases in their thorax area. That helps send them and buoy them to the surface. And that becomes a very reflective property within the natural self. It becomes a trigger to the fish. They see that reflection, it looks very realistic to them. And so I think it's a great idea to put silver beads on a lot of your pupas and a lot of your midge imitations. So this is nothing more than a glass bead, silver lined. And I'll usually lay some of these down on the table. And I will take my index finger, press down on the bead, and then just roll the bead right up on the, that's pretty simple. And then I'll take some red thread. This is a Timco 200R, which is really nice for larvae because it's a 2X long hook. And then we'll begin with a jam knot. This is another great fly for your lead fly. And I'll take some UTC gold wire, small, and that'll be for the rib. If you fish the San Juan, if you fish the Bighorn, if you fish the Sal Platte, the Yampa, you've probably seen red larvae. They're real common. Now we'll take this wire here. It's gold, small as I mentioned. And now we're just going to bury that, once again, with symmetrical touching wraps, right back towards hook bend. And once we get back towards hook bend, we'll advance our thread again, right up towards the bead. It's nice, smooth. Now we're going to reverse rib, counter rib, to create a nice little segmented look, and it adds a whole lot of durability to a thread body as well. Now I will put a piece of peacock curl for the collar. And we'll talk more about the properties of peacock curl here in a little bit, save it for a different fly, but I'm going to basically clip off about 1/2 inch here on the tip of that curl, and then I'm going to tie this in.
Hey Pat, you cut off your wire rather than helicoptering it off. Is that just by choice, or do you care?
I'm old-fashioned. I usually cut it off, but I think probably the trend these days is helicoptering it now. I think a lot of people are doing that. Oops. I don't know. I just have always cut it. Okay, so I'm going to tie that bugger in. And I just palmer that forward. Make a nice, full peacock thorax there. And I like that you have it a little bushy. I mean, it breathes life. It's going to help emulate those wing buds. Oops, I forgot to do one thing here. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'd like to take a black Sharpie here, color my thread. If you don't have a black Sharpie on your table, this is a good thing to have. Because if you're dubbing light bodies, like hare's ears for instance, and you want to finish it off, use tan thread. And you guys do that trick? It's a pretty slick little trick. now, rather than having that red showing there, it just blends right in, nice and black. And that phenomenal camera you have right there would have showed that red thread pretty well. So that's a mercury blood midge. Typically I tie them in sizes 18 to 22. More times than not, I use it as my lead fly. I traditionally drop some sort of a pupa behind it. It's a great bug. I've caught fish after fish after fish on that pattern right there. Again, the simplicity of that, you know, this stuff that I'm tying, don't let that fool you. They're pretty productive. Now let's tie a couple pupa. Once you determine that a midge hatch is in progress, in other words, we're starting to see adults flying around, and we see some maybe possibly on the water, then it's a good idea to think about switching over to a pupa pattern. And pupa are going to require a lot more finesse and skill when you're fishing with pupa than it does with larva. Larva, you just dredge, get it down, bounce the bottom, right? Pupa, on the other hand, it's going to require you to be pretty accurate with your weight. Oftentimes I'll start with a 6, move my indicator down. I think the biggest mistake that most people make with pupa is they fish below the feeding fish, typically because they're suspended in the water column. So you got to be really careful with your weight. You'll notice if you go down to the San Juan, for instance, those guys rarely use putty alternatives for the weight. They pretty much always use split shot. And they'll fish at like a 6 or 7 or an 8 split shot. They're fishing very, very light and pretty, you know, high in the water column at times. And you have to determine where they're at. I mean, they could be middle, they could be up high, feeding on the pupa right below the surface. So there's a lot of variables there. But this pattern here is called the Top Secret Midge. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it or not, but it's a neat little fly. It has a lot of benefits. I tie it from an 18 all the way down to a 26. The one thing that I like at this hook here, this is a Timco 2488. It's a wide gape hook. So in smaller sizes, you have a good chance of hooking your fish up with that thing, even down to a 26. And I tie them all the way down. I fish a lot of 24s this time of year on the South Platte on our guide trips. And it seems pretty far-fetched, but oftentimes the difference between catching fish and not catching fish is going to be fishing with a 24 instead of a 22. It really makes a big, big difference. Okay, so we'll begin with the jam knot. This is, oops, grabbed the wrong spool of thread. We want an 8/0. Hopefully my shoulder's not getting in the way here.
No, it's been good.
This is an 8/0 dark brown thread, and the rib is going to be a 6/0 white thread. And the biggest challenge is to try to get this rib so that it's very pronounced and this thread doesn't flare out. That's the challenge. So what I encourage people to do is to take a fresh piece of thread for each fly they tie. Don't use the same piece twice, because after handling it, it'll flare out on you and you won't get the same effect. So I'm going to take that and now I'm going to just simply guide that down the top of that shank.
And what material is that you're tying in?
That is a 6/0 uni thread white. So 8/0 for the tying thread, and then the white is a 6. Now I'm not going to counter rib this, but I'm going to actually take this now. And just work my way right up. If you do that right, it looks almost like a quill body. But that is challenging, like I said, to keep the white thread together. Some people will spin the bobbin and tie it in with a bobbin and do it that way. I still like doing it this way, but certainly that's another option if you decide to do so. That's what they do on the mid-current when they tie this. Okay, the next part of this fly is I'd have a piece of embroidery thread called Glamour Madeira. And you'll need to purchase that. You can get it at like a sewing shop, and depending upon who you talk to, some people say it's almost impossible to find, and so others have no problem finding it. But what you want is it's called Glamour Madeira, and I'm going to put it in here so you can see it. That's what it's called, and that's the information you need more right there. Prism white. It makes nifty little wings, merging wings. So I'm going to take a couple of strands of this. On 18s I use 2 strands, on everything else I use 1. Tie that in like that. And then, unlike our larvae, which are pretty uniform and worm-like, pupa, on the other hand, are going to have that robust thorax that contains the wings and the legs of the adult. I'm going to take a little bit of superfine rust brown dubbing. I'm going to build that thorax up. Just like that. And then we'll whip finish it. Great little fly, very effective during the height of a midge hatch. I'll pull that wing up. Come in, I'll clip that wing. The final thing that I like to do is take that wing now and just tease it out with your finger. Just like that. And you have a nice little midge emerger, pupa. You can typically fish it off an indicator most of the time, but you could even grease it and fish it in the film. There's a lot of different applications you can do with that. But slick little fly. Tice them up if you don't already have them.
Does that wing collapse when it gets wet?
It'll breathe a little bit.
So do you, when you bring it in, do you fluff it up by hand, or you just fish it all day?
I just fish it all day, pretty much drowned. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to, you could even, put some frog's fanny or something like that on it to try to, to fluff it out a little bit, and maybe possibly even get some air bubbles trapped in there. That would be pretty good. Okay,
So
let's
the pupa, are you fishing the pupa in like the top foot or 2 of the water column?
Sometimes if I do that, typically I'll do that more with a dry and a dropper, and that's a really good way to do that. But traditionally, when I'm nymphing, I'm nymphing more just with 1 split and 2 pupa patterns, depending upon where they are in the column too. It just depends. You got to do some visual observation there, but a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just, if I think they're keying on the pupa, higher up in the water column, break for a dry and a dropper. Okay. Now let's tie another pupa pattern. This is a Black Beauty. I'm going to tie a mercury variation of it. I tie a standard Black Beauty, which doesn't have this bead on it. I tie a Mercury Black Beauty, which incorporates the silver bead. I have a flashback Black Beauty with a piece of mylar over the back, and then I also have a tungsten Black Beauty that I would use for that dry and dropper application. So I can fish that Griffith Gnat was the one that we had in there initially, which I'll tie next, a couple of adults, and then you can drop something like this. Something with a glass bead or even a tungsten bead on it. Obviously they have different sink rates depending upon if it's a glass bead or a tungsten bead. This is a Tiemco 101. I typically would tie this in 20 through 24s. Begin with a jam knot. Right there. 8/0 black unite thread. I use small UTC copper wire. Extra small. We'll pull off a little piece of that. tie that in right there behind the bead. Then we'll advance this back towards hook bend. Then we'll bring this back forward. Do a lot of you people go down and fish the Guadalupe down near San Antonio? So all of these patterns that I'm tying will work really well there, and any tailwaters really. I suppose you'd probably go with a broken bow and fish that. Okay, so now we're going to reverse rib this. Right up to the eye there. And then I'm going to take a little bit of black dubbing. This is super fine black.
And this is another pupa?
This is another pupa, yes sir.
Okay.
So we're going to take this, now a little bit of dubbing here, and we're going to create that pupa. We're going to put a little ball of dubbing right in there behind that, just like that. Typically about the same width as the bead, just like that. So there we have a couple of larvae, a couple of my favorite pupa. Any questions with that? Again, pretty straightforward. Now let's tie a couple of my favorite adults. So now we start to see that the fish are starting to sip the adults now. So now it's time to think about switching over to a dry fly. Typically, on the onset, they'll be feeding on adults and pupa. Once they commit to the adults, they'll usually focus on the adults.
Pat, how can you tell if they're sipping on the adults or sipping on emergers?
It's a great question. Typically, I watch the rise form, and if I see just the back, then that's what I would assume that they're taking the emerger. And if I see the head come out like this, then I'm assuming they're taking the yeah. So that's you know, and observation is important on that, because that's where you might need to get, you know, a dry and a dropper or fish a greased leader technique with those if they're feeding, you know, on those pupa, because those pupa hang right below the surface like in a C shape, and they take quite a while to emerge, and it's a slow process when they emerge, and so that gives trout a really easy pickings on those midges when they're hanging there like that. Did that answer your?
It did. Good. Thanks.
Okay, so this is, we're going to start with a jam knot right here. This is a 101-18. I typically tie this 18 down to about a 24. In the Rockies, we have what we call the big spring midge. So it's quite a bit bigger. It's up to a size 18. That's why I'll tie some of these in an 18. And then we have, you know, another midges, you know, the smaller varieties that go all the way down to 24s. Sometimes you'd swear they're even 26s, very, very small. So I typically try to figure out, you know, what size adult they are, and then try to match the hatch accordingly. You know, you've been on San Juan before, you know that there's a couple different sizes of midges that come off here, a 22 and a 26, and in most cases they eat the 26 down there, the really small one. So this is just going to be a little thread fun. So this is a 8/0 black, and we're just going to take this and bring this right back towards hook in there. And then we'll advance that back forward with some symmetrical touching wraps. We'll take a piece of poly or Zelon, get a wing. taking a few fibers here for the wing. This pattern is called Matt's Midge. I failed to say that, but named after a good friend of mine, Matt Miles. I'm going to take this clump of Zelon here and we're going to tie that in right about at that 3/4 point on the shank there. We'll nip off that wing there. Bury those butt ends. And I like to prop that little rascal up like that, and then I'm going to clip that off at the same length as the abdomen there. And the final step will be to put a grizzly hackle on this, a rooster. And we'll tie this in so that the doll side is up. So this will be laid in there conventional dry fly style where the hackle fibers are actually going to flare forward. So we'll bring that around like this. Now we're just going to bring that forward here. Pull our hackle up, take 2 material locking wraps there, and then take 2 there. Snip that off. Whip finish. Oops, I got a couple of fibers trapped under that. And there you have it. Very, very simple. Very, very deadly. Single, newly hatched midge imitation. Any questions on that one? Welcome to come look at these too. In a minute, you're probably getting a better view on that monitor than you are. And then you'll also need, if you're going to be fishing midges, you'll need a cluster imitation at some point in your endeavors. This is a Timco 101, size 18 again. Now these, I would recommend tying them all the way up to a 14 and all the way down to a 24, because in bigger sizes they're nice clusters, and in smaller sizes they could imitate an individual midge. If you've ever been on Bighorn and San Juan and been in a midge cluster hatch, it's pretty amazing. I mean, sometimes you'll see clusters as big as a dinner plate of midges, and they're crawling around on each other, and a little chunk of that main cluster they'll break off, and a fish will come up and eat the whole cluster. It's an amazing thing to see. They get a lot of nutritional value eating a pile of those midges. I use the high-vis variation most of the time, but you certainly don't have to. You can tie a standard Griffith net. And I like to use, for all my post, if I'm doing parachutes, high-vis patterns, if I'm doing anything of that type of fly, I really like them with fly foam because, or with fly lawn, excuse me, because it doesn't create a lot of bulk, and you get very consistent flies with it. And we all know how difficult it is if you're trying to tie a 22 parachute Adams and you're stacking calf hair. This is the easy way around that. If you want, you can use white, or you can use the high vis color here. This is cerise. But for this high vis Griffith gnat, which was the fly I had in there, focus the camera. So I'll tie in a piece of that fly lawn. Come in and trim the butt ends there. We tied this one in yesterday's class, and tied the top secret yesterday as well. Pull this forward now, and this is what we call a thread wedge. We're just going to put a little wedge in there to get that to prop straight up, just like that. Then I'm going to come in here now, I'm going to bundle these up. And I don't per se go up that very far. Now if I was doing a parachute high-vis Betis, I would go up that a little bit further, because when I hackle that, I want it to hackle on the thread itself, and then I'm going to tie off on the post. But on this, it's not the same as that. So now I'm going to take a couple pieces of peacock herl. I like to show everybody that the eyes is what I like to use, just because it's fuller, and also the variety of sizes that you can have. So Mother Nature sized this for you. There's some 20s down here, and as we progress up this feather, they get bigger. So maybe all the way up to a 16. So that's what's beautiful about that. Another thing that's important to discuss is the butt end of the peacock. The quill is much thicker and wider than the tip. So if you tie it in on the back side, you have a tendency to mash down your fibers, and you don't get, it's not nearly as fluffy. So I always tie it in tip first, where the quill itself is quite a bit skinnier. So I'll tie in 2 of those strands. And we'll also tie in my grizzly rooster. I'm going to tweak that just a little bit more. Again, I'm trying to tie that, I want that dull side up. Now we're going to polymer that forward. Just like that. I'm using a fairly full piece of pearl there. Again, because in a cluster you have mating midges and they're crawling all over each other, and so there's a lot of movement with the legs and just the activity that's going on there. And so we'll go ahead and take this now, palmer that up. I tend to hackle them pretty heavy in case I want to use a dropper off of this. And then I'll take 2 wraps like that, pull that back again. Trim that off. And the final thing is going to be to trim the wing. Just like that. And just frizz that out.
Okay, what's this one called?
That's a high-vis Griffith gnat.
And this represents a cluster of midges?
It can be a cluster, or it can be individual midge tied in a smaller size. The advantage to this particular pattern obviously is it's easy to see, and that's what's nice. So if you got like a foam mat or a high glare situation, yes sir.
It's like a housefly to me.
It could probably imitate a housefly, yeah. So it's a good locator fly too. So sometimes what I'll do is, like if I'm fishing a 24 and I'm having a hard time seeing it, I can put a bigger one of these on there and I can see it. And you know, so if I'm getting a rise anywhere around my locator fly, it's safe to assume that he might be taking mine, and I would go ahead and set the hook on that particular situation. So that's the high vis Griffin net. Let's do a couple. I'm going to do a couple mayflies now. I have no idea how we're doing on time, so you just have to kind
We've got about 20 more minutes.
of. Okay. So let's tie a couple flies that will imitate mayflies. So Timco 101 again. I'm going to tie this in a size 18. I'm going to put a mercury bead on this. This is going to be a mercury pheasant tail. And we're going to go, in my program tonight, I have a discussion about entomology and matching the hatch and fly patterns and so on and so forth. So I think some of this stuff will make a little bit more sense. I'm going to use a extra small bead again with a jam knot. I typically tie my pheasant tails in 18 through 22 when I'm trying to imitate Baetis. If I'm trying to imitate something a little bigger, like a winter stone, possibly go a little bigger, or potentially a pale morning dun nymph. You can use like yellow pheasant. If you want to do a little winter stone, use black. You can use olive. You can do a lot of different things with pheasant tail.
Do you ever tie this with a metal bead, or you always like the glass?
I do. I tie them with all. I mean, I would recommend tying it in a standard pheasant tail without a bead, just regular, and then I'd tie them some flash, and then I'd go with the mercury bead, and I'd go with the brass bead, and I'd go with the tungsten bead. That way you've got a variety of them, particularly for dry and dropper rigs. That's the way what I would recommend. Now, I try to keep this fly as thin and sparse as possible. And so I'm going to use the 4 fibers for the whole entire fly as far as the pheasant tail is concerned. And this is, you get the center quill here, and if we're to take our 4 fibers off just like this and pull them straight out, that helps me align those fibers. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull them down. Get stuck together a little bit. Typically what I'll do then is I'll grab the butt, slide my fingers down, transfer it over. Drop the tail in. And I can adjust the tail just by doing this. Bring it down like that. Typically about 2/3 of a shank length long is what I try to achieve on my tails there. Then I'm going to take some gold wire. This is Lagarton. This is a very thin varnished wire. It's very expensive in comparison to UTC, about double the price, but I like it for my pheasant tails simply because it's very thin, it's varnished, and it just performs well. So we'll tie in here. You can see how I grab that wire, put it right across the backside there, 2 wraps, pull these fibers here, and we'll come in and get the tag end. So we've secured that wire at 2 different spots, which makes it quite a bit more durable, and it's not going to come loose when you're beginning to rib it. Now we'll take this here and we'll go back to the tail. We'll bring those fibers forward, just like that. Lock the material into place. Got a stubborn one there. Now we're going to reverse rib. Moving that wire up. Clip that off. And then I'll bring 2 legs over to my side of the hook and 2 legs over on the opposing side there. That one's being a little stubborn, so we're going to lock him in there. Then we'll take a piece of Mylar tinsel. This is going to be a flashback. Certainly you don't have to tie flashback, but I like the little extra flash. I think it helps fool those really selective fish. We'll tie that Mylar tinsel in, and then what I like to do is check my proportions here to make sure that I'm about halfway down on that shank there. Then I'll take my peacock curl again. Get one of these that's a little bit further down the feather. Tie that in tip first.
Do you ever use a strong hurl?
I rarely do. Now I usually do about 7 turns here. Tell you when I do use strong hurl is like if I'm tying a halfback nymph or something like that, where it really doesn't matter and I need a lot of bulk quick and stuff like that. That's what I would use that. But I typically, now we're going to pull that Mylar over the top. Like that. Clip that off. Whip finish. Trim that. I can grab the legs behind the wing pad and trim those legs off, just like that. There we have it.
Actually, it's pretty.
Yeah, that would
Very
be
simple,
Does that
very
look nice?
effective,
Yeah.
but that's, see how, you can kind of see how thin that baby is, you know what I mean? And that's what's important, is if you're doing these little, to imitate Datus, and thin and sparse, really, really key. So, I think we've probably all tied pheasant tails where we're tying in the tail, nipping off the material, and then tying in more, you know, but if you just keep tying in all this material, then your fly gets a little bit bulky. And that's what we don't want to have, is we don't want to have a bulky pheasant tail. So, again, vary your colors, you know, you can tie it in red, tie it in black, tie it in ginger color, olive, and you can literally fill up a whole box just in pheasant tails to imitate a wide range of aquatic insects.
Pat, do you ever tie that in a jig head variation?
I don't, but that would be, you could very, very easily. Okay, let's do one more fly. Then everybody can kind of come up and look, we can answer questions. This is an RS2. And an RS2 was designed by Rim Chung on the South Platte back in the 70s. And it's basically a mayfly emerger. and it's a very, very effective fly anywhere. It's effective on a freestone, it's effective on a tailwater, anywhere mayflies reside, this fly will fish quite well. So I got a Timco 101 in there again. And I'm using the 101, as you all know, it's a dry fly hook, but I use it for my nymphs. And I've really never had any issues. Timco makes a good hook. They're expensive, and you're going to pay a lot for them, but they're good hooks. You hardly ever find a defective one in a box of Timcos. Very rarely do you find one that'll straighten out on you. So, you know, it's sometimes I think you get what you pay for as far as hooks are concerned. So, let's begin with some 8/0 gray thread and a jam knot there, and we're going to tie the tail out of some dun rooster fibers. And I'll typically take this here and just kind of comb these down with my thumb, just like that. I don't think I'd make a very good weather person. And we'll take a little bundle of those guys there. I'm not real happy with the way those came off. Having a hard time keeping those aligned. Normally I can nail that right away, but I'm having a difficult time with those. And that camera is so good. So again, we're going to do about 2/3 of a shank length long. The biggest challenge with an RS2 is to keep it thin and sparse, and that's where a lot of people make a mistake. They fish very, very well when they're tied thin and sparse. Bulky imitations certainly don't fish as well. I'll begin by stacking all the fibers in my dubbing in the same direction here.
Notice you cut off the tail.
Yeah, I had a couple little stragglers there. I wouldn't necessarily do that, but if I get one that's goofed up on the tail, then sometimes I'll just give it a quick trim on a 45-degree angle, and you can't even hardly tell. They still look. It's a nip, so it's not going to be supporting the fly. So, but for some reason that feather was giving me some fits there. Now this is really important. See on the top end of this dubbing noodle right here? See how there's just a couple fuzzes? That's going to be the start of that dubbing noodle.
What material are you using for your dubbing?
That is a good question. I'm sorry I didn't mention that. It's a superfine Adams gray.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, my bad. So the thing here is we want that top of that dubbing noodle to be just, man, that thing looks like it's ginormous and it's teeny. I was kind of afraid this camera might be too good. Okay, let's get just a little bit more. And so this Adams gray dubbing and the Adams gray unite thread matches up pretty good. You can see I made a couple thread wraps right back over that stuff. You can hardly see it there. And we want a slight taper. I'm going to get right up into that 3/4 point on the shank. And then we're going to take a piece of flat ribbon floss. trim this butt ends of this. I'm going to tie this ribbon floss in here. Just like this. And this is going to make a big, we're going to make a big loop wing out of this. So I'm going to pull it forward. And I'm going to bring it back like that. Just kind of scoot it back just a little bit. Tie that down. I'm going to redo that real quick. You got to be careful you don't crowd your head there. Not that anybody's ever done that in this room.
How far back do you want that loop to go?
This is kind of your discretion on the wing. Some people like to tie them real short, like a little low profile on it. I like that big bushy wing. See how it's pretty full? It's not quite to the shank, but it's close. And I think that the reason this fly fishes so well is it imitates, an emerging mayfly. And so that wing is popping loose. So I like to have it it's pretty good. It's not a shank length long, but it's pretty close. It's probably 3/4 of a shank length long.
So is it almost to your tail tie-in? Where your tail
Pretty
is?
close, pretty darn close. I think if you mash that down, you can see, it's pretty close.
Okay.
And I've got a whole bunch of them over here. You can look at them as well. Now we're going to dub the final part here, and we're just going to start dubbing right behind the eye, and we'll dub right back to the wing, and then we'll come right back forward, just like that. It almost looks black, and it's gray. And then we'll whip finish. Now I tie this in a variety of colors too. Gray is the predominant color that I tie it in, but tie it in black, tie it in olive, tie it in PMD, tie it in brown, tie it in anything. Any color you want, you can have a mayfly merger with this particular wing. Works very well. This fly is deadly on the swing. Foam wing emerger in this, when you're drifting like this and your fly swings around and then it starts to lift up, it's gonna imitate those swimming betas. So when betas come off, they do this. When they're going up, they're swimmers, and that's oftentimes when the fish are keying on them, is when they're actually in that swimming stage. And you can watch a fish. You'll sit there and you'll be watching it. I see it all the time. Fish that's going to come over here and he's come out of his way and he's going to come back and grab this thing and then he's going to come back in like this. And that's how you know that they're eating blue wing olive emergers. They're eating betas because of that swimming action. And so you can have a perfect dead drift during the height of a beta hatch, and sometimes your fly will get ignored, okay, because it's not swimming. Does that make sense? The swimming action of the mayfly is the trigger that makes them eat that. And so how many times have you been ready to recast and you got a hit, right? You had one on. It's because it's lifting, it's tightening, and then it's just rising up. And the thing is like the foam wing emerger, and they'll wobble a little bit because of that wing, all right? And I think a lot of it is this wing too. It's just deadly. It's just the flash. So.
I'm sorry, did you tell us how to get it, that last little swim?
Just let it tighten.
Okay.
And there's actually, some people do a lysing ring lift where they actually, you're towards the end and you're actually lifting it and imparting that action too. So that's one way of doing it. Another way you can do is swing a soft tackle too. It's another effective method to imitate those. So
You use that with a two-fly rig?
do what now?
Two-fly rig?
I do depth, and this is always going to be out on my trailer. The furthest fly out because it's
What do you normally use as the point?
I would fish. A buckskin is a real good one. I fish a lot of buckskins. I would, any type of a larva or a nymph I would run as my point. And the attractor, really changes with the season for me. And so let's just say it's a high water season, it's May, you might choose a scud for an attractor. You might use an aquatic worm for an attractor. Maybe in June a Pat's rubber leg. Maybe let's say it's July, I would use a Mitchell split case or a bar merger for my tractor. So what I try to do is I try to change my tractor with the season, and if you can find in a tractor that catches fish, then you really got something going. And that's the hard thing, is to find a tractor that's working. Because you'll find most of the time you'll catch more fish on the trailer because it behaves more naturally. It's further from the weight, and it just is a lot more natural behavior. We can run 3 flies in Colorado, so I run 3 flies. I run in a tractor and then 2 trailers. But if you go to Montana, you can only use 2. If you go to New Mexico, you can only use 2. And so you got to make sure that you check the regulations. I'm not sure what it is in Texas. I think it's 2, right? I'm not sure. But whenever I fished with Chris Johnson down in
I don't
Guam.
think we have a regulation.
Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. You know, a lot of people.
Yeah, trout streams.
At Texas, anything short of dynamite.
So a lot of people, you know, they get a little worked up when you're fishing tandem rigs, just because they feel like that potentially you're in a higher risk for a tangle. But I really I think you're going to do better with a multi-fly rig as a general rule. So.
Pat, do you use a loop knot on the lower one, or clinch?
I use a clinch. And I don't improve it, but I just use a standard clinch on all my flies. I do come off the bend, so I'm running a bend. You know, sometime if you want, I can come back. I have another talk that's called Tips to Catch More Trout, and it's this kind of stuff, and I don't know if it would appeal to people, but it's rigging, it's just, you know, so you don't want to get too technical with people, but at the same time, it's different. If it's something I'd be happy to come back and do at another time if you wanted something like that. So, or we could do it during the day, you know, and then do another talk in the evening or whatever. I mean, I'm very flexible. I just been tying flies in my hotel room all day. So, so did that help? Was that beneficial?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much.
I like tying flies, so I'm looking forward to sharing my program with you guys tonight.
So get some dinner, ask Pat some questions. We'll be back here at 7 o'clock for our general meeting.
That is, it's called Pearl.